Are you a tenant of a commercial lease in a retail shop or an office, or are you a commercial landlord? This video is just going to run through the latest mandatory code of conduct relating to leasing principles at this time. As an overall look, before I unpack it, there's obviously it's very vague. There's a lot of vagueness in there. There's a lot of gaps. And that's because, as they've specified in here in this document, that every lease and every business is really different. So they're really trying to encourage a lot of flexibility and understanding between landlord and tenant, and trying to get them to realise a common goal of making sure that the tenant kind of survives and that there's still a big risk on the landlord. So they're really trying to bind them together, but there's a lot of holes here, which I think it's going to be a good time to be a lawyer. I think maybe when this is all done, it's going to be a good time to be a lawyer. I think there's going to be a lot of business for your lawyers out there. Anywho, let's get to it. So yeah, it's been hard for them to be specific with uniform rulings. Basically, landlords can't terminate during this pandemic period or a reasonable post recovery period. So again, that's very vague and open. There's going to be a lot of confusion around that, but I guess that's a positive for tenants. Most of it is positive for tenants. Tenants must remain committed to the terms of their lease otherwise. So if they violate I interpret that to mean that if they violate other terms of their lease, a lot of the code won't be relevant to them. A lot of the benefits of the code might not be relevant to them. Not 100% sure. That's not super clear to me. But the other normal requirements of the lease, apart from the big one, paying rent, must still be adhered to. So getting to the actual rent and reductions and all that. So I guess there's a difference between a reduction, which is, I guess, reducing the amount of rent that's just paid normally. A waiver or a rent-free means a portion of the rent is not ever actually paid anymore. So what it is, this code is kind of making it proportionate to the reduction in trade. What does that mean? So if the business has reduced its trade, I guess revenue in a way, by 100%, then what this code stipulates is that the landlord, there must be benefits allotted proportionate to that reduction in trade. So if it's 100% reduction, benefits from the landlord basically have to match that 100% reduction in trade. Now, at least half of it, no less than half, at least half of it, has to be in the form of a rent-free or a rent waiver, meaning forgiven. So if it's 100 grand rent, trade has been reduced by 100%, then 50 grand of that for the relevant period, so if it was a year, would be forgiven. Okay, so if it was the monthly amount, half the monthly amount, if you want to divide it into a year, then the other half can be deferred, which is obviously more favourable to a landlord. They get that part at some point. So if there's been a 30% reduction in trade, then 15% of it, 15% of that normal rent amount would have to be waived, no more, not ever paid, or just benefited in the form of rent free, and then the other 15% minimum could be then deferred. So I hope that's easy enough to follow and not too confusing. For anything that's deferred, so again, not paid now, but then going to be paid back later, obviously when these businesses can get up and running. So the terms of that has to be justifiable it can't cripple the business getting back up and running. Very vague and open to interpretation. And it will be added on to, I guess, the remaining lease term, so split and amortized over the remaining lease term, or a 24-month period, whichever is greater. Any reduction in statutory charges to the landlord, so examples of that are land tax, council rates, things that they pay to the government bodies, or insurance, benefits. The code is stipulating they get passed on to tenants, not just held for the benefit of the landlord. No fees or interest will be applicable, and rent reductions will be paused according to this code. So there's not really much penalty, and any rent reductions planned will not be relevant during the pandemic period, or I believe the reasonable post period. If there's problems with this, there's mediation, appropriate to whether it's an ombudsman or small business council or whatever it is, depending on the part of Australia, that'll be applicable. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else here. I mean, without overcomplicating it, there's a few other bits mentioned in the code, but that's the overview, and that's basically the principle that stays in place unless alternatives are made. And obviously the code says that landlords and tenants are free to make alternatives to these principles, this code, if they see it more appropriate between them. So again, it's really, the landlord is anchored to the tenant's reduction in trade, as long as it's caused by directly or indirectly by the pandemic situation, which most of the time it will be at the moment. Yeah, look, it's vague, it's open. A lot of businesses will get to survive, I guess, because of this. A lot of landlords are going to see a massive reduction in income, but there's no real winner at this time. We just have to work together and work through and try to be fair and try and work collaboratively and become a team. Landlords and tenants becoming teams. Who would have thought? But I think if you don't look at it this way, there's not too much happiness around it.